All right, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Angela Willits. Several of you I've seen at these other brown bags, or I already know you, but I'm really glad that you're here. So this is the third of our three-part series on trauma-informed care, and today's emphasis is on trauma-informed educational settings. And this is the talk that actually got me wanting to do the series in the first place. So I'll be honest in saying I'm the most excited for this talk today, which is why I'm doing the whole thing. No, I'm just kidding. That was a joke. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to do a quick review, and I mean really quick review of trauma-informed care and what it is. So some of you have been at the other brown bags. Lots of us have a working knowledge already of what trauma-informed care is. So we'll just quickly review that. The goal there is just to get us all on the same page since we're talking about this concept. And then I'm going to introduce this idea of trauma-informed educational practice. So what is it? What does it look like? What should we consider when we're thinking about it? And then we're really going to emphasize one of the 5 key principles of trauma-informed care. The first one, which is safety, which is the 2 people who have researched this. Safety is what students have brought up consistently as what they think of when they think about a trauma-informed classroom or education setting. So we're going to talk about some considerations for increasing a sense of safety. And my goal is really to give faculty and students, because we have a sort of a mixed audience here, which is what I was hoping for, ideas of how we might move towards a more trauma-informed setting here within our own school, but then also wherever you go beyond your schooling here, how you can bring these ideas to the setting that you're in. So just a reminder, we're not talking about traumas today, we're talking about trauma in general, but anytime we talk about anything really, there could be something that could be difficult for any one of us in the room. So just a reminder to take care of yourself, and a couple of key components to taking care of ourselves are recognizing when something is difficult or perhaps triggering for us. So first recognizing and then responding to that, and you're the best judge of how you respond to that, right? So doing what you need to do to help yourself feel okay. So that might be breathing, that might be shifting your attention if you need to, or another preferred coping approach. But you please do what you need to do as we talk about this topic today. So I first want to give some acknowledgements, which also allows me to give you kind of the context for how this talk and this series came to be. So for those of you who don't know, I'm a big fan of podcasts. I have about a 35 to 40 minute commute each way into the school. And so I listen to, there's some really outstanding social work podcast series out there. My favorite one is put out, it's called The Social Work Podcast, and the gentleman who does that is with Loyola University. But the university at Buffalo School of Social Work has a podcast that they put out bi-weekly. And I was listening to one of their podcasts interviewing these 2 researchers, Janice Corello, who at the time is a PhD student. I'm not sure if she's completed that yet. And then Dr. Lisa Butler, who's faculty at the UB School of Social Work. And Lisa Butler is a really well-known and respected researcher in trauma-informed care. And Janice Corello is a PhD student who had a previous life as an English instructor, where sometimes students would write about trauma, came into the doctoral program with this interest in trauma-informed pedagogy in educational settings. So I was listening to this podcast and I was inspired, and so I checked out their 2 articles that they've written on this subject, and I think they get the award for best titles, really critical or intriguing titles. So Practicing What We Teach, Trauma-Informed Educational Practice, and then Potentially Perilous Pedagogies was their first article. Teaching trauma is not the same as trauma-informed teaching, that in fact there's a big difference. So I went into my class that day to Social Work 440, my generalist social work class of my 44 students, none of whom were here. I was going to give them credit, but none of them were here. But I said, you know, I want to do something with this, and I'm not sure what that is, but let's think about it as a group. So we spent about 30 minutes talking about what do we think about when we talk about trauma-informed care, and what do we think about it when we think about our school. And then they got into small groups, and they hopped on the internet in their small groups, and they started looking for articles on the topic. Now, from their research, the only articles that came up surrounding trauma-informed educational practice were in fact these two articles, because that's, as far as I know, all there is. This is sort of a newer idea about in education being trauma-informed. But we found lots of articles on trauma-informed care in general. So acknowledgements to them for helping me formulate these ideas for the Brown Bag series and for the focus for today. And then I want to acknowledge Jennifer Sampson, who's here. She's one of our MSW students in the part-time program. We've been doing an independent study all semester, and she's been a huge inspiration and teacher to me around what she's learning regarding trauma and trauma-informed care. And she gave a stellar presentation at the Dean of Students office yesterday about trauma-informed care and how the Dean of Students, when interacting with student issues, she's in 2 weeks giving another talk to them about how to be more trauma-informed within their practices. So she's a rock star. And then Scott Webb, who we had here for the very first part of this series, talked more generally about trauma-informed care. He was just great, and I got a lot of ideas for him, so I just wanted to acknowledge him as well. Okay, so real quick, what is trauma-informed care? So this is a quote from one of Lisa Butler's articles, who I mentioned before. To be trauma-informed is to understand how violence, victimization, and other traumatic experiences may have figured into the lives of the individuals involved, and to apply that understanding. So we first realize that trauma is widespread, and then apply that understanding to the provision of services and the design of systems so that they accommodate the needs and vulnerabilities of trauma survivors. So that's trauma-informed care in a nutshell, and that's really only one definition of it. There's lots of other moving parts to it, but the general principle is that we realize that trauma is in the room and we respond to it in effective and supportive ways. So the goals of a trauma-informed approach, so that first goal, first do no harm. So that's of course at the foundation of this, to work with people in a way that does not cause additional harm. In whatever way we're working with people, whether if it's within school or in some sort of social work setting, but to not cause any additional harm is goal number one. And then in trauma-informed care, they talk about the 3 R's, and then some people who write about it have added a 4th R. So we'll talk about these more in detail in a little bit, but so first off, realize the widespread impact of trauma. So truly realize that most, if not all of us, have been touched by trauma in some way. So that doesn't mean that we all have PTSD or that it's a daily part of our life. All of us, however, have, I can pretty safely guess, have experienced a really difficult experience that was really scary or overwhelming and really, really difficult that might have impacted us for a while after. So we realize the widespread impact of trauma. Next, we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in others. So when we're observing behavior, sometimes behavior that might seem difficult or resistant, that rather than sort of blaming and saying, what's wrong with you, you're not being how you're supposed to be, that we sort of take that step back and wonder, what's this about for the person? So what happened to you, right? What's the bigger picture here? And of course that's very strengths-based because it moves us away from blaming and labeling to being curious and concerned, right? So then the 4th R is respond. So once we realize the impact, recognize the signs, we respond by integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices. So what we're here today to think about is how do we as a school respond if we are on board with these first two things, how do we respond as a school? Okay, so I'm going to hope to get you on board with these first two things, and then to give us some ideas really in this area of practices. What are some practices that allow us to respond in the classroom, in this setting, in a trauma-informed manner? And then resist re-traumatization is what happens when you're practicing trauma-informed care. So it's kind of captures all of it. So there's a couple of definitions just to get under our belt, just to get us all on the same page. So re-traumatization, when we hear that term, what it's referring to, at least as these authors and some others write about it. However, I think there are different opinions about what re-traumatization is. But for the purposes of how we're going to talk about it today, the triggering or reactivation of trauma-related symptoms originating in earlier traumatic life events. And Scott Webb, when he was here about a month ago, one of the things that he said was, a situation, attitude, interaction, or environment that replicates the events or dynamics of the original trauma that triggers overwhelming feelings. So that's perhaps, some might say, a looser use of the term of re-traumatization, but the general idea here is something that's happening in the environment that's bringing up this old traumatic stuff in a way that's getting in the way of the learning or whatever else we're hoping to do in the moment. And then vicarious trauma, and depending on who's studying and talking about this, there's some different names. There are some differences between these, but these terms get used together a lot, or interchangeably. So secondary traumatic stress or secondary traumatization, compassion fatigue. So like I said, they talk about slightly different things, and I can do a whole other brown bag on that if we're interested in that at some point. But it's basically that trauma-related symptoms result from exposure to traumatic content. So in other words, Charles Figley, who coined the term compassion fatigue, would say the cost of caring, that this is the cost of caring. So exposure to stories, firsthand traumatic experience, or not firsthand traumatic experience, accounts of firsthand traumatic experiences impact us, right? So that's vicarious traumatization. Trauma. Any questions about these terms, this overall idea of what is trauma-informed care? Yeah, Jenny.
Question, if you don't mind.
No, yeah, please.
For the historical trauma, would that be a separate thing? She's like, why did you ask me that?
No, I love. So there's another great podcast actually on historical trauma. That I was just listening to that actually broadened my understanding of historical trauma. So I used to think of historical trauma or intergenerational trauma as sort of, there's this, someone has experienced a trauma, and there's maybe a trauma that actually occurs to a larger culture, right? And then it gets sort of passed down from family to family. But this podcast that I was listening to talks about actually the cultural impact of trauma on sort of the life of the culture of that community, and that is a part of the traumatic aspect, I guess, of how culture is destroyed, right, or disrupted. So anyway, that's not answering your question, that's just on my mind because I just listened to this podcast. But absolutely that fits into here, and there's a whole other talk that I think that we should do about that when we think about how people are impacted by historical trauma, especially students of color, and what that might look like in the classroom, and then how do we respond to that in a trauma-informed way. Yeah. So a lot of what we talk about, we can hold in our minds historical trauma as well, so I really appreciate you bringing that up, and I think that deserves its own focus. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so you heard me mention earlier these 5 key principles of trauma-informed care. So this comes from some of the earlier writers on trauma-informed care. And then SAMHSA, who has a great website, actually Jennifer shared this with me, that offers like a guidebook to being trauma-informed. They also emphasize a sixth principle of trauma-informed care, which kind of gets at what you brought up, Jenny, emphasizing peer support, cultural, historical, and gender issues in our in those R's that we were talking about, realizing the impact, recognizing the responses or signs or symptoms. So like I said, we're going to focus on safety today because that's the one that comes up a lot, although I hope in the future we can expand and think about all of these other areas as well. So what is trauma-informed educational practice, or the acronym that Butler and Corello uses, TIEP? So you might see that in here. So trauma-informed educational practice aims to do a few things. One is that we recognize the risk of secondary traumatization and re-traumatization, so those two terms that we talked about a moment ago, in the classroom, the field, and other school spaces. So trauma-informed educational practice means that we recognize that there is some risk involved to our social work students of entering this field because the nature of the work involves exposure to trauma, right? Through what we hear our peers discussing that they're experiencing in field, through readings that are assigned, videos that we watch, right? Social work isn't light, right? We're dealing with oppressed and marginalized and suffering populations, and trauma is at the heart of all of those, I think it's fair to say. So we recognize the risk to students entering this field and the risks that could be within the classroom setting, within the field setting, within other school spaces. And then the aim is to reduce rather than increase this risk through a trauma-informed approach to pedagogy. So pedagogy basically means the approach to teaching, the way of teaching, the teaching philosophy or practice, the way that the art of teaching, as I like to think. So approaching it from a trauma-informed lens. So learning is the primary goal, right? My guess is that we're all on board within an educational setting. Learning is that's what we want people to be doing here. Learning is the primary goal, right? So if we think about a trauma-informed approach in an educational setting, then some goals that we have stemming from learning as the primary goal is to remove barriers to learning. So when we think about disability accommodations, for example, we absolutely accommodate disabilities that could get in the way of someone's learning, someone being optimally successful in the classroom, right? So trauma-informed care or trauma-informed educational practice, we can think about along similar lines. What are the barriers to people who have experienced trauma that may come up in the classroom, in the work, in the field, and how can we reduce or remove those barriers as much as possible? Now, my background is as a trauma therapist, and I had a wonderful supportive team of trauma therapists that I worked with, but none of us talked about how we were affected by the traumas that we were hearing. And at a certain point in my career, I was really affected by the traumas that I was hearing, to the point that I was having secondary trauma symptoms, and I sought counseling and sought out a colleague. But it wasn't easy to do. It was really difficult for me to do. But I had this sort of mentality of, you know, when it comes to working with trauma, you sort of figure out how to do it, and the good clinicians figure it out and they get good at it. And if you haven't figured it out, well, then you need to do more work, and that's sort of your problem. So then in the classroom, when I teach about trauma, I would have this, for a while, I had this in the back of my head, like, well, I need to talk in a matter-of-fact way about trauma because we have to respond to it in a matter-of-fact way, right? And then someone said to me once, I presented up at Eau Claire my talk on trauma, which involves talking about traumas as examples. And I was talking to the field faculty afterwards, and I said, you know, how do you think it went? And she's like, well, it was really, really good. I just think that, I don't think the students were ready for some of this content. I think some students were triggered. So I had, you know, like my sort of defensive response, like, well, like, this is trauma, like, you know. And then it occurred to me that if the students in the room were triggered, they can't learn. And if that's why I'm there, if that's my goal, is for students to learn, then I need to do what I can to prevent them from being triggered. Otherwise, they can't do that simple thing that we've all come together to do, right? So that's one of the goals. Another goal is to maximize student resilience. So what this means, you heard me say earlier that let's acknowledge we take some risks when we enter this field as far as how we're going to be affected by the work. And so I see part of our task as educators is to help strengthen our students to be able to do the work, to build their resilience around, how do I do this work and be okay, right? So we talk about self-care, and we hopefully teach about self-care, but we want to maximize their resilience. We want to help strengthen them to do this work really well. And then the third goal is to promote emotional safety while learning, and it sort of overlaps on these other goals around not triggering. But that we're in a better place to learn when we feel safe, right? When we can relax, absorb the information, get really engaged with it. If we still feel safe, we can do that better. So those are the big goals of trauma-informed educational practice. To break that down just a little bit more before we talk about how do we do it, what does it look like? A couple of things that I pulled from Corello and Butler's articles. So many, if not most, students enrolled in clinical training programs report trauma histories. The statistic is anywhere from 50 to, I want to say 90%. 2 weeks ago in the talk we had that, and I should have put it back up on this slide. But the reality is that many, if not most, students enrolled in clinical training programs, that's not just social work, report trauma histories. So if we know that to be true, then we need to exercise what we might think of as universal precautions. So we need to assume in every classroom, whether you're the student or the instructor, assume in every classroom that there is an unknown subset of students who are at heightened risk for re-traumatization or vicarious trauma as a result of personal trauma histories, perhaps mental illness experiences, and current challenges or difficult life situations. And that's one of the sort of the hallmarks of this realize is just assume that it's there. We can't know for sure, so that universal precaution piece. The other thing we should just assume is that our students are going to be impacted by traumatic content in the classroom and in field, that it's going to impact them. I remember a point in my graduate education where I felt in a class, I can't remember the class, but I remember sitting there feeling totally overwhelmed and thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can do this work. Do I want this to be my life? Right, where like this is hard and sad and progress and change is sometimes slow and I'm overwhelmed, like is this what I want? And I was panicked. Now that has subsided, I'm okay. But I remember that moment, right? And when I share that with students, as some of you are doing, I see people nodding because I think many students have had that experience. So then we, as a program, should be thinking about how do we help them when that is their experience, right? Okay, so that's the first R, realize. The next one you might remember is recognize. So we recognize certain behaviors are maybe responses to trauma. These aren't exhaustive lists of behaviors that might actually be trauma adaptations. This is a tiny sampling, but just to give you a sense of some of these examples. So certain emotions, being overwhelmed, sad, angry, sometimes immobilized, may actually be a response to being triggered or to trauma, prior or current trauma. Some actions like being disorganized, absences, poor test performance, difficulty receiving critical feedback, being defensive or stressed. And 2 weeks ago, Nick actually gave a great example of giving a really strong student critical feedback and the student sort of crumbled and couldn't tolerate that. And them having a really nice conversation about, you know, what's this about? Is there something else going on here? So a couple other pieces to recognizing. Many students have trauma histories that may complicate their interactions with authority figures. So if we think about trauma is all about power and control. And to go a bit further, a traumatic moment means the person suffering from the trauma is not in control. If they were, they would be able to do something to stop this awful thing from happening. So trauma is about not being in control. So when a person who has experienced a trauma enters any sort of scenario where they are not in control, where there is a power imbalance, i.e. the classroom, that can trigger that old stuff, all those old feelings of not being in control. And so recognizing that some students may really struggle with interacting with authority teachers, like instructors, for reasons that have nothing to do with how nice I am as an instructor, right? And then we appreciate how a trauma history may impact a student's academic performance, even without trauma being a topic in the classroom. So it doesn't have to be a trauma class. We don't even have to be talking about tough stuff, but recognizing includes recognizing that trauma may be a part of this, even if the student's not being triggered because of what we're talking about in class. And then that third R, respond. So just again to reiterate, this breaks down to overall policies of programs and organizations, procedures, the way things are done around hiring. We could even think about, in our setting, the way things are done around promotions or tenure or evaluations or grades, right? But like I said, what we're really going to talk about today is practices and we'll call it trauma-informed pedagogy. And Carello and Butler say our process of teaching should be informed by and consistent with the implications of the content we teach. So if we're, as social workers, behind a trauma-informed care approach, right, which I think we are, you've all learned about this in your classes, we should be thinking about it in how we teach. So what is trauma-informed pedagogy? It's strengths-based. It's not labeling, blaming, isolating. It's recognizing strengths. It's person-centered, so it's not making sort of lump assumptions about what students or faculty, for that matter, should be or how they should be or what they should be doing. It's looking at the individual and being curious and concerned and compassionate. And it's solution-focused. So you heard me say earlier, let's think about how we build resilience, build capacity for doing this difficult work. What it's not, so trauma-informed pedagogy is not a recommendation that we eliminate or remove traumatic or difficult material from the classroom. So that's not at all what it is. I would say that that difficult material needs to be in the classroom so that we can teach how to deal with it. That's our opportunity, right? If we take that out, where are students going to learn that, right? So we recognize, of course, this is what we do, we're social workers, that this field requires us to teach about trauma, of course. At the same time, we must also be mindful of how we teach it, as well as how we teach trauma survivors. So that kind of all ties into what we've been saying so far. Trauma survivors are in the room, so we need to be mindful of how we teach about trauma, how we teach those in the room. So that was kind of my first goal, is get some buy-in as far as this is a good idea, this is important, right? How did it go? What do people think? Worthwhile us considering this? Yeah. Making sense what we're talking about when we refer to trauma-informed educational practice? And we'll break it down in just a minute a little bit further as far as what it looks like. So any questions so far?
This is something that you may be talking about in the next section of this, and it also might be one of those things that doesn't have a clear answer to. But there's this, when you think of trauma-informed care, like a lot of folks, I think about people in a vulnerable situation who I assume have some difficulty and are struggling. Mm-hmm. And in an education setting, I guess I have more of an assumption of someone who's done some of that work themselves and are now ready to kind of take it to another level. And so the balance between supportive help, I mean, I get the whole, don't get me wrong, you can say certain things a certain way, and there's definitely inappropriate ways of like hammering a certain subject, and this is really helpful to that. But getting to a place where making the decision that maybe someone is not ready to put themselves in a situation, and when do you get to that place where, okay, this is, I want to be supportive, but at the same time, this is more support than you're going to be able to expect doing what you're going to be doing. So when do I say?
So at what point do we say that we're talking about realizing the impact of trauma and recognizing the signs and symptoms, and perhaps as educators or colleagues, at what point do we say this person is so impacted that it's getting in the way of them being able to do the work? And we think about protecting our clients and the learning and training experiences that they need to have. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And this would be a great talk, Angela, for any school that doesn't have our model of field, because I'm thinking of liaison models. How do they address field activated trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no space for that. They're out there by themselves. Yeah. So what's really interesting is that the UB School of Social Work, where Carrello and Butler reside, are sort of the trendsetters in this idea, and they also have what might be the best student impairment policy. So I plan to bring this to, I don't know, I have to figure out who I'm going to bring it to. I don't know if we have a student impairment policy in our policies and handbook or whatever we call it. But UB School of Social Work has a really well laid out, how do we decide if a student is so impacted by trauma or something else, substance abuse, life challenges, medical difficulties, right? How do we make that determination, and then what's our plan for moving forward? So I don't think the two things have to be separate. I think that we can absolutely be trauma informed in our approach to education, and we can be concerned about impairment. And at what point do we sort of decide, right? Yeah, so that's a great question. Did you have your hand up earlier?
I was going to, but I think I got it.
Okay, sure. Any other questions? Okay. Well then let's move into what does trauma-informed practice look like in the classroom. So I'm going to cover a couple of different areas of consideration with some ideas for each of those. So processing content. So in other words, the actual content that the instructor is providing in the classroom. Allowing time, hang on, did I skip one of my slides here? Yes. So first off, the content itself, before we skip to the processing of the content, the way that we present the content in the classroom. So as I did today at the beginning of this talk, this is something that instructors can do, is just give that gentle reminder of that students take care of themselves. It seems like a little thing, but it gives permission, right? It's the instructor saying, I'm okay with this, okay? So do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. Attend to your emotional needs. It's also a nice modeling of self-care and prioritizing self-care. Instructors should consider the appropriateness and necessity of materials. So when it comes to choosing readings or videos, especially if they're heavy in trauma content, what do I think is really important, and what are some things that may not be as valuable or as essential that we could take those out? Because we want to eliminate the stuff that maybe is less helpful and at least vary the intensity of the material, right? Lisa Butler, who I've mentioned tons of times now, gave this example of, she was doing a training in New York not long after 9/11, and someone came up to her before the training started and said, you know, I was there on that day, and she could tell that this person probably had active PTSD and was fairly traumatized by it. And he, in like two minutes of their conversation, conveyed to her what he saw that day. And she writes about how she was haunted by that. Just his retelling of what he firsthand experienced that day. She was haunted by that for days, maybe even longer afterwards. So this quote she has, "The emotional toxicity of some experiences, even simply in their description," so simply being told about them, "cannot be overstated." So this one really hits home for me when I think about, there's certain things that I've watched, documentaries or things that I've read, that they still trouble me when I think about them. Some of them are very impactful and inform my understanding in really important ways, but they still stay with me and trouble me. So I think as instructors, we want to be really conscious of that, right? And sort of finding that balance. For difficult but critical material, providing a warning or a heads up so that students know what to expect. So whenever I'm going to show a video, actually not whenever, the disclaimer I should have said at the beginning is I'm not perfect at that. I know that I do things that aren't trauma informed, right? All the things that I'm going to suggest you do, I don't always do. I mess up too. So this is like, you know, pie in the sky, all these things we would think about. But so we give heads up about what is the content, what might you expect, the severity, so how difficult is this material, just so you know, and the duration, how long is this going to last, right? So remember you heard me say earlier about a loss of power and control. So anytime we can give a sense of control, and by giving someone a heads up, we're giving them a sense of control, even a little tiny bit. So sometimes this idea is called trigger warnings, and there's been some conversation or discourse within educational settings more recently about trigger warnings, and are they a good thing, are they not so good? So I'm interested in opening it up to what people in the room think about trigger warnings. But I was emailing, you know, I was like the Corello-Butler groupie now, and so I was emailing both of them, and emailed Janice Corello to get her opinion on trigger warnings. And she said lots of really cool things, but this one I especially loved. Trigger warnings are not about content, they're about power. So that's the first piece. When I give a trigger warning, I'm recognizing that I'm running the show here, right? I get to decide what I show you, and you just have to sit and watch it, right? There's power in that. So giving a trigger warning is about sharing the power and saying, here's what I'm going to be showing you, just to give you a heads up. And if I've done that prior work of take care of yourself, I'm sharing the power with you in the moment. And then she goes on to say, from a trauma-informed perspective, trigger warnings provide an opportunity to model an empathic response. So if I, as your instructor, am saying, this video is a little tough, it's tough for me. I've decided it's important and worthwhile to show, but this is difficult content. I'm modeling for the students that I'm impacted too, and you might be impacted too, and that's okay. And guess what that makes students more likely to do? Talk about how they're impacted, whether they come and see me privately or they open it up in the course. So if we convey that empathy, we help build that resilience, build their ability to talk about that it's difficult. So any other thoughts about this idea of trigger warnings? Yeah, Jenny.
What it makes me think about in particular, if it's the idea that it's power and not content, and like in public schools and some of the stuff that's out there for how do you have trauma-informed public schools, the idea of keeping the consistency so things aren't a surprise. And I think about it, a class I had a couple of years ago where I had the students felt I changed the rules in the field, in the middle of the field, of like saying other people are going to be giving feedback, not just me. And it triggered huge trauma for some of the students where they're like, they didn't know what to expect. They're like, we understood what the expectations were, now you're changing it. And it was like, it gave us an opportunity to talk about it. But I think we sometimes do that in the classroom. We think, oh, let's change it up a little or make some variety. But if it's not, if somebody needs to know what to expect, that makes it really traumatic for them, particularly that whole feedback issue.
And that makes me even think of like changing the syllabus, which seems like a fairly benign thing to do, but the syllabus essentially is our contract with the student, and for students who really need to know what to expect, they may be paying really careful attention to what's in the syllabus. And if we sort of you know, casually make changes to it, oh, we're not going to do that today, instead we're doing this, that can really throw some students, right? Of course, all students are preparing and always know what we're doing, and so it probably throws all of them, but yeah, that's a great point. Any other thoughts about trigger warnings?
Well, so I have a couple of thoughts about trigger warnings. I think they're important because of the power differential. As a student, when I walk into a classroom, I have a very different hat on than I do when I walk into work or some other setting where I maybe have a different level of confidence or support, etc. So that, I think, plays into the power issue as well. But I've noticed for myself that when I'm given a trigger warning, I tend to take a deep breath and kind of say, okay, now I'm prepared. You can bring this content on, and I'm in a place where I feel like I can better handle it than if I'm just suddenly, in cases where I've not been given a trigger warning, like, whoa, I didn't quite expect that, and now I've got this image in my head, and you know, I'm not going to process it correctly.
So instead of being able to learn, now your mind is somewhere else.
Yeah, and my mind is in a place where I'm identifying with the person who's been traumatized, and I'm maybe really thinking about how difficult that is, or I'm overwhelmed, and again, so then my front brain is completely shut down.
Yeah, so I love that piece about the hats that students wear when they walk into the classroom, right? Most of our students look different in the classroom than they do in the field. I love going to my field evaluations because my students are dressed so nicely. They look fabulous in field seminar, don't get me wrong. But when I see them, in their setting, I first of all feel very proud at how highly professional they look. But they look different and they act different. They feel different to me in their agencies than how they feel to me in the classroom. And so I've talked about it sometimes as like this armor. Like when I was walking into work as a clinician and knowing that I'm going to be talking to people about trauma all day, I had a particular armor on that really well equipped me to do the work. If I'm like in a different setting and someone approaches me with traumatic content, or I go to a movie that I didn't realize this was what it was going to be, I don't have that same armor on, and I'm more vulnerable, and I'm more impacted. Yeah.
So this is where I struggle, and we've talked because so as an instructor, so I teach death and dying, and so students watch films where people are dying, and I also teach sexual assault prevention. So a number of students will have been sexually assaulted who are in the class. So material that's definitely could trigger.
Yeah.
My struggle, I think, though, is, and I do, so as of right now, I do give trigger warnings. And, you know, I always give a heads up as to what we're going to do tonight or whatever. I don't say this is a trigger warning. I just give a heads up, you know, take care of yourself. But I see what you're saying about going in the field and putting the armor on. But I've also talked with students who went in the field and didn't have an armor on and weren't prepared to be triggered. And so that's what concerns me. I do think, so Jennifer, I agree with you. I think that in order to learn, it's really important that even if you're shut down because you've been triggered, you're not going to get it. But then I think, how then do we, and maybe field is the place, I don't know, how then do we get our students to where they're prepared? Because you know, when someone's dying, I've gone in and all of a sudden what we're talking about is something that does trigger for me, not something I expected. I can handle dying. That doesn't trigger me. But, you know, so how I handle it is going to impact my client. And shutting down is not always the best thing, actually, because shutting down and putting a wall up can also be something that's sensed by your client. So I'm not against or for, this is my struggle, is I want to ensure that when students go out, they can take care of themselves. So does that mean that we teach them about when you're triggered these are some things you can do.
Absolutely.
So then I would feel much better. But I feel like if I give a trigger warning for everything, they're not going to be prepared. So I don't know. I'm like on the fence.
So lots of things there, and just to unpack a couple of things. So first off, I love what you said about sometimes students enter the field and they haven't developed this armor yet. And in fact, I think that first field placement, that's part of the work. That may be a 75% of the work, is learning how do I do this work and be okay, right? And so what better opportunity than in a class that has such emotionally heavy content like a death and dying class, to have a part of the pedagogy being not only teaching students the content, but how do you handle the content, right? And so that's where I see the utility of trigger warnings is, so one of the things that you're all grappling with in here is like, this is heavy stuff. And every time you come in here, you know it's going to be heavy stuff. So how do you be okay with that, right? And so I give you a heads up about what you're about to see, but it doesn't always make it any easier what you're about to see. So I think everything you're saying makes a ton of sense, that this is a great opportunity for us to actually teach them. And it's where that building up resilience, what better place than in the classroom? So that when they go out into the field, they know what it feels like somewhere else to be activated, like in the classroom. And they have figured out ways, kind of like what Jennifer was saying, like if I have a trigger warning, I do my thing. Like I figure out, like, okay, this is how I am still present and focus and follow this and be okay. Yeah. But they have to learn that, right? I think after we've been doing it for a while, we assume that this happens automatically. I remember that learning curve of, man, this is heavy. Like I got to figure out how I handle this stuff. How I go home and be okay, how I sit in the moment and be okay, right?
I just want to say one thing. I really love the idea that Angela's bringing up, and also that you brought up, that difficult content should be taught. I absolutely think it should be taught, because you're so right. I want to know what I'm going to be dealing with. I don't want to walk in unprepared. But at the same time, I just want to throw out a reminder that when Angela or you say to me, as the instructor saying to the student, this is tough stuff, then I feel a little bit better about my own reaction to it. I feel like, yeah, this is hard. There's an acknowledgement there. And it makes me feel better about, okay, I'm not the only person here who may think this is difficult to process. And that opens doors for me to talk about it with other people, whether it's an instructor or a classmate.
And that it's continuous, I think, and I talk about that it's often changing, because certain points in your life, certain things have happened, and you might be fine with something, and then all of a sudden it triggers something, because your life situation has changed. And I think, because a trigger warning, my biggest question is somebody might put a big sign up saying, well, you know, this is violence, don't watch it, and it doesn't, that isn't what touches me, it's something else that, you know, it's like the dog that gets run over, you know, or something that where you don't even think about that piece of something triggering, because it can come up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, so the reality is that being triggered is going to happen.
Right.
And we have, part of the learning is how do I have that happen and then work with it and be okay.
So then I think that's where the pedagogy, that's where it's really important now that instructors, when we set up our classes, it's not just about giving trigger warnings. We have to go a step further, because to me, that's where I struggle. I don't find it that helpful. Just to say, just get trigger warnings, because then I struggle, you know. But to say that we as faculty also need to build in discussions and of ways that, okay, so you're with a client who's dying and you know, you get triggered. So getting people to think about how do you handle it without just shutting down, because then you're not present. And this is the one time this person's going to die. It's their only shot at doing it right, or according to how they feel. So I do like that. But I think that would be something really we have to think about consciously as a school. Sorry,
Well,
I'm going off on that.
Well, and it's why trigger warnings are only one actually little part of being a trauma-informed educational setting. And something you said, Jenny, made me think, reminded me that we'll give trigger warnings about the stuff that we as instructors think is triggering, and we have no idea what's actually going to be triggering. So even if we're giving trigger warnings for some stuff, we're not preventing students from being triggered. It would be impossible because we don't know every person's history and experience, and what's triggering for one person may not at all be triggering for someone else. So we're not, as instructors, and I'm not at all suggesting that you anticipate every difficult moment, right? It's kind of, that's sort of a microscopic view of this. It's a much bigger approach than that, right? And more holistic. It's much broader than just trigger warnings, because we can't anticipate all of that, right? However, if we share the power, students are much more likely to come and tell me when they've been triggered, right? And then we can talk about it. So if I've opened that door, more students are likely to walk through it, and that's what I'm hoping for. So if I have a student, if I show a video and I've given them a heads up and I have a student that leaves the room and they're missing the video, I mean, students miss my awesome videos for lots of reasons. They're sick, right? They are doing something with field, they're going to a training, or maybe they miss it because they decided to walk out because it was difficult. So students miss stuff for lots of reasons, not just for being triggered. But that is communicating to me that it was difficult, and then I can reach out to that student afterwards. And what a great opportunity for me, right, to extend myself to that student and say, hey, I noticed that you left the room during the video. I just want to check in. You can respond or not, but I just want to open the door that if you wanted to talk to me about it, you can. Right? Okay, so I'm cognizant of the time, and that I'm early in my material on how to do this. So I might move a bit more quickly. I think a lot of it is fairly straightforward, so you can look over the slides after we end and you'll get the gist of things, but I'm open to answering questions. I wouldn't say no to like doing another talk like this because there's lots to say. So I'll move us a little bit more quickly. So when it comes to processing the content, and this ties in with everything we've been talking about, when we show something difficult, allow the time to process it, right? We can't just jump into the next thing on the agenda. We're not teaching our students how to process difficult material if we do that. In my crisis intervention class this semester, I was showing this clip on, it was the HBO documentary on Veterans Crisis Line, so callers receiving calls from vets in crisis. And we were bumping up at the end of class, and it occurred to me we had like 5 minutes left, and I was going to show this video up until the end of class and then send them out the door. So I like got up quickly and turned it off and said, it would not be very trauma-informed of me if I didn't allow us some time, minimal as it is, to process this. So we allow the opportunity to process difficult content. We might ask, what was the most difficult material? We do regular verbal check-ins during class. So as the instructor, I'm not just up here plowing through what I've got to get through because I decided that's what's most important today. I want to pause occasionally and check in with how people are doing. We can also, and I haven't done this, although I'm going to try it out with the note cards today, written check-ins inviting students to share their responses to content. So it might be emotional responses. It might, I use note cards to get feedback from students about how was class today? What did you like? What did you not like? But we can use written check-ins if students are more comfortable that way, checking in. The other thing I'll say about written check-ins, if I'm teaching and I think one of my students is struggling, I'm not 100% that I remember to do this, but I will most of the time email them afterwards and check in and just say, hey, I just wanted to check in with you, or I'm still thinking about what you said today and I just wanted to touch base and see if there's more that you wanted to talk about with that. So email is this wonderful opportunity for instructors to reach students outside of the classroom. And then, of course, we follow up when students express concerns. So I have a story I was going to share. I'll share it. About I had a student in a class a while back who had had a recent traumatic event and a recent diagnosis of PTSD. And the student saw in the syllabus that I was going to be talking about PTSD in one of the classes. And she let me know that she needed to meet with me, and we met. She filled me in on what happened, and I was so grateful that I was so glad that I knew that this thing happened and that she was struggling in this way. And it gave us this great opportunity to plan for what she was going to do in all of our classes, but especially in the class on PTSD. And we worked together on what was going to be best for her, and I respected her being the judge of that. She decided she wanted to come to the class, so then we talked about, so when you're in the classroom, if this, or this happens, what do you think you're going to do? She decided that she wanted to do the small group activity, which involved coming up with different ideas of traumatic experiences, different things we might encounter as social workers. But she decided, I need to be in a group with people I know. So, okay, I can make that happen. So she was in a group with people that she knew, and she knew that she could leave at any time. And she hung in there for the whole class. And then we met afterwards to talk about how it went. She discovered some things. One of the things that she said afterwards was, I'm not in as good of a place as what I thought I was, because this was actually really difficult for me. I made it through, but this was really difficult. And then we checked in a week later, and she hadn't been sleeping that well that week. And she was fine. She got back to where she was. But it was an honor for me to get to help her along that, because this is probably going to come up for her for years after, right? And so she did some really great work, and it was great to be able to team up with her on that process. Okay, assignments. I'm going to skip over this, but one real quick piece. Sometimes assignments ask for self-disclosure of some sort. Reflection papers do, and I love reflection papers. I actually love it when my students share about themselves, but I have to acknowledge, if I'm an instructor eliciting that, I have to be prepared to respond to it. And so if a student shares something in a paper that's a big deal, I need to be willing to take the time to reach out to them afterwards about it. So we be mindful of the students. Some students might think that if I push my own emotional comfort, if I share a whole lot, I'll do better on in the assignment. And so when we're constructing assignments, we want to be thoughtful about that. We talked earlier about students may be triggered by receiving difficult feedback, so we might incorporate drafts where we give non-judgmental feedback before they get the final grade. So that's just one idea. Instructor behavior. So what do we do as an instructors? We talked about the power imbalance. Soliciting student feedback is a great way to share power and creating a safe environment. Not being minimizing or dismissing of students. Responding both emotionally and intellectually to student feedback. So when I do mid-semester evaluations with students, the next time we come back together, I show them what they said. I put it up on the PowerPoint. I said, so here's the feedback I got. And if something made me feel bad or made me feel worried, I share that. And I say, yeah, when I was reading this, I was thinking the same thing. I'm not crazy about how that's going with the class either. So I don't just from sort of, like instructor voice say, this, here's what I heard and here's what we're going to do. But I also talk about how it impacted me personally, because that helps students feel a little bit more, like I'm a little bit more responsive, I think. We allow transparency whenever possible. Be prepared to provide support and referrals. So here are some of my tips. I think this is what we'll end with in the last 30 seconds. And then I'll take us to the note card. Tell people what you're going to do before you do it. So this is the main thing I learned as a trauma therapist. So I always try to start out my class with the agenda that tells people what we're going to do so that they know what to expect. And that includes activities, if we're going to watch a video, if we're going to do a role play. I want them to know that in advance. You wouldn't believe the number of times students on my evaluations give me the feedback that they liked that I told them what we were going to do each day. It's a little thing, and it goes a long way for people who have trauma histories. Be aware of your actions and eliminate surprises. So sometimes when students are doing group work and I'm coming up to the groups or walking around the room, and I learned this from working with veterans who startle easily, I'm not always perfect at it, but I almost always, if I'm going to walk behind someone, I say, I'm stepping behind you here. I give them some sort of heads up that I'm about to walk behind them. If I'm going to lower the lights to show a video, again, I'm not always perfect, but I try to say I'm going to lower the lights before I actually lower the lights. It's a little thing, but for some people it's a big deal. If I'm going to close the door, I say I'm going to close the door before I close the door. Being in a closed room is triggering for some people. When students come to meet with me in my office, the first thing I always say is, do you like the door opened or closed? And they get to decide. And if they say it doesn't matter, then I usually close the door because it's loud in the hallway and I like us to have privacy. If they say keep it open, we keep it open, right? Because it's a small space. It could be difficult for some people. Risking some vulnerability, so don't ask students to do something you're not comfortable doing. So if I'm asking my students to do a role play, I'm going to do the role play in front of them to show I'm taking a risk here. I might really screw this up and do a really bad job, but if I'm asking you to do it, I need to be comfortable doing it too. provide choice whenever possible, offer breaks and let students know when their break is coming. So I like to, you know, there's a point in each 2-hour class where the students start to get anxious and wonder, when are we taking a break? And so I like to ease that by just letting them know at the start of class, here's when we'll take our break. Or at least 15 minutes, or way before break is going to happen, here's when we're going to take a break. Again, I don't always do it, but I try to. Okay, so there's a couple of other ideas around things, classroom characteristics, like letting students choose their seats. Some students like to have their back to the wall. Things around student behavior. Things around self-care. Buffalo School of Social Work has a self-care online course that they require their students to do. Check it out, it's really great, and I would love to see us implement it here. Colombo, just one more thing. Brooke and Becca, no, Becca, you don't. Brooke, you know what I'm talking about. Colombo, it's a therapy approach. Anyway, doing this, being trauma-informed setting, requires leadership support, education and awareness across all of us, faculty, staff, and students, and we can't do this without meaningful student involvement. So the students who are here, who are continuing here next year, I would love to hear your ideas for how we can increase our trauma-informed approaches in this wonderful setting that we all get the privilege to be in, because it's a worthwhile effort. It's totally worth doing. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and you can, I'll stick around. If you don't want to do this, you don't have to if you have somewhere to be, because we're 2 minutes over time. I would love to hear your response to any or more than one of these. So one idea you take away from this talk, one idea for future action, what we could do here, or your just general reaction to the topic or other feedback. So again, if you're pressed for time, don't feel that you have to stay to fill out the note card. You could always drop it in my mailbox up on the 3rd floor. But I'd love to get just a brief check-in of anything that stands out to each of you. And that's that. Thanks so much.